All right, vlog. I'm not. At this point, I'm still not sure if I should have made this philosophy, but I think it fits more under vlog because I'm not actively talking about philosophy itself. I'm talking about the problems with making philosophies, and that's that. And I should preface this. This isn't a huge problem. It seems like, and I'll explain it actually first. There doesn't seem to be a lot of modern philosophies. I mean, really modern. I could call it like neo or new neo or whatever, even though that's redundant. But I could go, the now times. I'm not saying specifically in the 20th century, but certainly since the time of fundamental change within many societies. I'm going to call this at the fall of the USSR, which wasn't the end of our society as we know it, which would of course bring on a lot of philosophical change, but it was certainly a change in the power structure. It pretty much dragged power out of Europe. At least it dragged the total consensus that power was found from Europe out of the common picture. Certain countries like Russia, which are formerly the USSR or formerly the main chunk of the USSR, are still, the countries like that are still highly powerful, very powerful, but it changed the idea. Now power is pretty much found in North America and Asia, and maybe not secondarily, but it seems to be sort of the three kind of areas which have power are Asia, North America, and Europe, rather than it being Europe and then secondarily Asia, North America, and then other places only because Europe cares about them. The thing is, since pretty much the fall of the USSR, there hasn't been a lot of pure new philosophical ideas. At first, when I was trying to think of 21st century philosophers, it was easy because there's 1,000 million, because that's one of the things. You think about sciences and arts and such are just inevitably going to be more distinct just because there's more people. This time of great scientific development of ours, I don't think it's really because of anything. It's not because of the centuries of scientific development we had before it. And even those weren't caused by themselves. But I think that the reason all these things were caused is just because we're slowly getting into a time in which more people could be born. And when more people are born, I don't think the ratios go up of what people do what. Not really, but what does go up is that there's just more people purely to do a thing. So we'll say in the example, 1 in 100 people are painters. It's probably more than that, or maybe it's less. But we'll say 1 in 100 people are painters. When there's 500 million people on the planet, there's not going to be many painters. And then, of course, painters of moderate quality, painters of good quality, painters of note, great painters, ones which define a generation, are going to be super, super rare. But nowadays, with 7 billion across the planet, moving on 8 billion, so we'll call it 7.5 billion, if 500 million could once a generation, or maybe even 2 or 3 times a generation, produce some, or not a generation, if every 100 years you got we'll say 3 to 10 people who would just define some great thing, maybe a country, maybe a people, maybe a nation, maybe a religion, but whatever, you get one of those great painters and great works. In the world, that is. The thing is, and that's with 500 million, because you can look it up, the world population basically remained stable until like the 1600s. Of course, that makes sense. When it basically went, let's just start moving upwards at an exponential rate. But, there's my head. once it really started packing on, now instead of 2 to 10 or whatever, we're getting 7.5 times more than that. Instead, we're getting like what, 70 to 100 people per 100 years or whatever. It's more or less every year or so there's someone who's great enough. And of course, in this internet age of ours, it's drowned out by the multitude of people who are close enough to great. To be seen, because it's so easy to be seen nowadays. Someone who's just pretty good will certainly be noticed, even though formerly you had to be the best of the best to get noticed past your local area, or at least past your nation. Oh wow, I've really skewed off the topic. It's the same with philosophy. We'll say 1 in 1,000 people are philosophers. It's probably more than that, but we'll say 1 in 1,000 people are philosophers. Not just people who like to think about philosophy, people who actively contribute to philosophical thought. We'll say that, 1 in 1,000. Formerly, there should not have been many philosophers. That made sense. And then once in a while, they would write their works. It would take 50 years, and there'd be more. And then someone else would come along and write something new down. We build up philosophical ideas as time goes on. The problem is, we don't seem to be increasing it with our population boom. It sort of did up until, I'd say, the mid 20th century, maybe before that, but it seemed like as we were getting more people, we'd get more philosophical development. But nowadays, we have, I don't want to say none, but for the first time you get to see how I gesture in these videos. It's not that we're getting none, but we're getting very little for the population that we have. You have a ton of people willing to talk about, analyze, even innovate on previous philosophies. But thinking about it, the last distinct, well-known, brand new philosophical concept I can think of was probably Rand. And as far as I'm aware, that was like USSR era. So I don't know. Try and think about it. After objectivism, what was the last major philosophical brand new idea, well known? I'm not talking. There might be some. I'm sure there's always some people willing to write down their ideas, but just never really caught on, or at least never became well known. But in this age, it should be infinitely easier for everyone to become well known. So, when was the last time someone came up with a brand new idea? Not just an innovation, not just, we're going to revive Socrates, not something like that. We're going to reimagine Socrates, something like that. That's happened 1,000 times. It's not to say we're in a philosophical dead period, I think. It's just that everyone wants to analyze these philosophical ideas. They develop on them, like the Descartesian. Anyways, people are totally fine with spending hours on metaphysics and figuring out how accurate Descartes was, even though they kind of cut him off at the second meditation. People are fine spending all day doing that, but when was the last time there was something purely new? There's two problems I think that are holding us back, although I don't think they're enough to hold us back as much as we are. So there must be something else going on. But first is that everything's been thought of. There's no way it's true, but it's that so many ideas have been thought of that at this point, even with more people, it's going to be way harder for something brand new to come up. Because even like you analyze objectivism and you can pull out its roots and say, oh, it's this, this, and this, just reimagined. But still, there's no way that's true. It helps, like the Greeks, despite the fact that there was like no people alive at that point. Well, not none, but not many compared to today. Basically had a golden age of philosophy, the Henolean, it's Henna something philosophy, the Greeks and Romans, just because nobody had ever thought about this stuff before, at least not, and also wrote it down, or had the audacity to do it and separate it from direct principles of theocracy yeah, it wasn't religion based. It was the first time people who were thinking about the world itself, if not directly separately from religion, thinking about it in means other than what can we do that won't piss off the gods. They were thinking of why would the gods care about this? Why do we exist? That kind of stuff. And it was the first time it was ever happening. So I can understand why, despite their low population, there was a ton of Greek philosophers. And how by the same tack, we'd have less philosophers than if there were 7 billion people on Earth at the time of the Greeks, and we'll just assume they were distributed in the same way that they were at the time of the Greeks, there would inevitably be a lot more philosophy then. But I think now we've moved past a lot of it, so it's a lot harder to do philosophy. But on the other hand, we shouldn't have slowed down by any means. It seems like even though we have, in the very least, we shouldn't have slowed down. We probably should have still sped up. We have 7.5 times more people, and yet we seem to be producing new philosophical ideas at the same rate, as far as I can tell. And that's odd to think about. You think about previous centuries, and you got pretty distinct philosophers. And I'm not saying they have to be entirely distinct. You don't have to say, none of these, Plato got a lot of his arguments from Socrates, so he's not original. I'm not talking about, I don't want to have any of these kind of arguments, at least I don't want to just draw it there. Honestly, I think the distinction can be drawn even between people like Hume and Descartes, but I speak English. There is an S at the end of that word. I am going to pronounce it as Descartes, in the same way that maths, as the English spell it, I'm not going to call it math and spell it with an S. I'm going to call it maths, because they're right. It is multiple maths. But the problem is that there isn't even those kind of Hume and Descartes differences anymore, really. Sure, if you want to be really nitpicky about it, there's 1,000 different people who are not even just improving philosophy, but people who are who are making new versions of old ideas and are completely distinct from each other. That's fine. There's a ton of those people, and that's inevitable. I call them philosophizers, not philosophers. People who want to improve and innovate on old ideas to get them closer to the heart of what they were talking about. Like I mentioned earlier, the people who are Dicesian, I think is the term. Anyways, the people who are analyzing metaphysical concepts. And honestly, metaphysics is fun to consider, or at least it's a nice way to sink your time in terms of scholarly pursuits. But at least I think so. But there's no solid, fresh, this is distinct, this is my new philosophy. There's no objectivisms anymore, it seems. I'm sure it's going to come along, but I think the problem is with 7 billion people, we should be getting, there should be one almost every 5 or 6 years at this point, honestly, you'd think. In fact, we should honestly be getting them more like maybe every 4 years, I think, as an average. I did at one point, I think, no, I haven't calculated that out. That would have taken too long. I considered calculating out. That's what I did. But, if you average out the time in between different philosophies, we'll say from 1300 on, if you calculate out the average, I think it'd probably be something like 48 years or 50 or 60 years or something like that. Nowadays, with 7.5 times as many people, you'd think you'd split that number down 7 times, it'd be like 8 or 9 years. It has been more than 8 years since objectivism, I know that. So there should be at least, I think at this point, 2 distinct 20th century brand new philosophies, and there just isn't. And that's the thing that I'm worried about, or that I'm considering. I can talk about, in my philosophies, my purely philosophical concept, but in that series, the ideal thing that I would be talking about is analyzing the philosophical concept of the time, or at least one of the main philosophical schools. I would be talking about this decade's philosophy, but it just doesn't happen. If I want to go to the most distinct last philosopher, it's Rand. And here's the thing, in this video, you might be sitting there like getting angry at me because I've missed all of these important people that I just don't know about, or that I haven't even thought about that I would know about. The problem is, or actually that is the problem, it's that if these kind of philosophers that I'm talking about would be known by people, Rand they would be at least as known as Rand, because a lot of people just hated the concepts that Rand brought up from the get-go, but that doesn't change the fact that a lot of people know the name Ayn Rand or Anne Rand or whatever. They know Rand, they know the Shiphead, they know Atlas Shrugged. At least they know of the names, even if they've never read them. I can't really blame them. Well, there should be new people doing this. I guess that's all I wanted to bring up. I'm going to continue to talk about my philosophical ideas as they come to me. But if it does happen, if it happens to be every 20 years, I just calculated it wrong, and we're going to get it every 20 years. And if this vlog is hopefully still going on in 2020, then I'll make sure to talk about it. So the year of good sight is, well, that's actually a good phrase for it, 2020. The vision I wish I had. All right, enjoy oh yeah, this is one of the 2 series that doesn't have generalized outro, so enjoy the dogs. All right, so I suppose he's saying goodbye for us. Yeah.